the side panel carefully. Be especially careful. I mean, whether or not you have tempered glass, you should still be careful if you have like an acrylic side panel window or something like that, because they can scratch very easily. I would advise leaving the plastic wrap on the side panel window until you're absolutely done, 100% complete with the build. I know it's tempting. I know it's tempting to peel it off the second you see it and go, ooh, ah, but trust me, you'll thank me later. It's not worth it. Now I'm also going to remove the back side panel, and you guys should too, just in case you find any accessories back there. A lot of times case vendors like to put the accessories inside of the case. They like to hide them either in the drive cage or in the power. So go ahead and take your accessories out. You will be needing them very soon. In fact, right now. Let's go ahead and put the case on its side so that the main side is facing up and the back side is facing down. Boom. And here's where you want to bust out your motherboard I/O shield that I told you to remove from your motherboard box earlier. Take it out of the plastic wrapping, like so. It's like an ASMR video now. And you want to make sure that you line this up properly. Generally, the shiny side, if there's a shiny side, is going to face inside, inward of your case. And the really nice outside, or the really nice part is going to be outside, obviously, because you can see it. And the way this goes, so you already know it's going to go either this way or this way, right? With the shiny side inside. Now it's just a matter of which way does that go. You can just line it up with your motherboard, or I can just tell you a rule of thumb. Where you see the little circles, all the little audio circles, that's going to go on the bottom, towards the bottom of the case. That's pretty much the best way to tell. And then just go ahead and pop it in. This can be a little tricky. It's hard to know once you pop this in, and it's sort of, you have to kind of do it by feel and by sound. So you hear that? That was part of it popping in. And you want to just double check. You have to look really closely to make sure that the entire perimeter of your I/O shield is flush. So you just want to double check, push it firmly around the edges, make sure it's all good in there. Alright, now before you get too excited and go about installing your motherboard, there's a couple things to mention here. First of which, if you are using an air CPU cooler tower sort of thing, like I am right here, then this doesn't really apply to you. But for those of you using liquid-cooled AIOs of any kind that have radiators and things like that, you want to make a note of whether or not it makes sense to install your motherboard first before you install your radiator. It can kind of depend. For the most part, I would say the rule of thumb is you install your motherboard first and then your radiator, but there are some instances where the reverse is true and makes more sense for that particular configuration. So you just want to sort of think it through. If you're not sure, maybe just look up in certain manuals to see what they suggest, or if it's not there, look online, but that is something to point out. The other important thing to note before you install your motherboard is that you have your motherboard standoffs installed. Now, NZXT has already done us the solid of pre-installing these, and these are these little metal pegs that are sticking out of the motherboard tray that give your motherboard a little bit of lift. It kind of prevents the trace layouts on the back of your motherboard making contact with the steel surface of the case itself to prevent any sort of shortages and things like that. So it's very important that you have these in place. Again, NZXT's already put them here, and if you're lucky, you'll actually get one in the middle, a peg in the middle that's it's got a little bit of a tit on it, a little bit of a lift off. It's a little bit taller than the other ones. It looks a little different than the other guys, and that's just so that you can have something to latch onto. There's obviously a hole in the middle of your motherboard that will latch onto that middle peg when you're putting it into place, and then just sort of lock it and freeze it so that it's easier to work with and more stable. It's not moving around and stuff. It's really nice to have one of those, but if you don't, no worries, you can still get by. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that not all standoffs should be in the same place for every situation. For example, these are in the ATX configuration for ATX motherboards, which I in fact have right now. So that's good. So I don't need to change anything here. But let's say you were building for some reason with a micro ATX motherboard and you needed to rearrange the standoffs to accommodate that particular form factor. You can either look in your case manual, or if it's not there, it could be etched directly onto the motherboard tray, where here it says, micro ATX, ATX, ITX, and it gives you sort of a legend, and you can figure out where the standoffs go for that particular form factor board. Now then, we can go ahead and mount our motherboard now that that's all out of the way, and I like to grab the motherboard by either side. I really try my best not to grab it by the CPU cooler. That's a bad habit of mine, I know, I need to stop. And then I just sort of just push it in there, just gently. I like to look at the back of the motherboard, or behind the case, so I can align the I/O, the rear I/O, with the I/O shield. And then if all goes well, the middle peg, the lifted peg, will latch on, and voila. The motherboard's not installed yet. Don't put the case upright. It'll just probably fall out and something will break. We still need to screw it down. So we've got some screws here. You're going to want to get the accessories out that came with your case, with your chassis. And then with your hopefully metallic tip screwdriver. This is where the metallic tip really comes in handy. You're just going to go ahead and screw those down. I should mention, when you're installing the standoffs underneath, you want to make sure to tighten them, but you don't want to over tighten them because they can strip and then they'll just like do the infinite spin, and that's not good because then these screws won't really go in at all. And then likewise, when you're screwing in these screws, you want to make them snug, but not too snug. Again, because you could strip them, and if you over tighten them, then removing them, when you remove them, you might actually pull out a standoff, or the standoff might come along with it, and that can be a pain sometimes to work around that. So you can expect with a standard ATX motherboard that you have to input about 8 or 9 of these screws. We only have to do 8 because the middle standoff is a raised one, but if yours is not raised and it looks like all the other ones, then you will have to put a 9th screw right there. And voila, now we can say our motherboard is properly installed. We can put the case up if we wanted to, which we're going to actually need to do now to install the power supply. Alright, so I've got my power supply here, and sure enough, it is partially modular, which means you have some of the essentials that are just hardwired into the power supply, and the accessories, or the peripheral cables, if you will, are separate. So you could plug these in as you see fit, depending on what devices you want connected, which is really nice. Helps clean up cable management a bit, because you're only connecting the cables that you need instead of everything and trying to find a place for the ones that you aren't using. So I've kind of already figured out which ones I need. The ones that are connected are the standard essentials that most people will be using anyway, which is your 24-pin ATX. This goes to your motherboard directly, as does the 8-pin EPS. This is the CPU connector. And then we've also got one for PCI Express. This is for your video card. We've actually got 2 8-pin connectors. These are 6+2 pin design. You can see that they kind of split off, and this is going to be plenty for our video card, so we don't need to add additional PCIe cables to this guy. What we do need are our peripheral cables. So we need some SATA cables here, both for our 2 drives. We do have an SSD and a mechanical hard drive that are SATA. They use SATA connectors, so we're going to need to power them with this SATA plug. You can see that there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 SATA connectors on this one cable. So hopefully if we wire things properly, and this cable is long enough, we'll be able to wire both of those hard drives with one cable. 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. And then we've got one more of those. This is another SATA cable, exactly the same as SATA power, that is actually a little bit shorter, and there's only 2 connectors on this one, and this is going to be going to our NZXT Hue Plus. You may have other SATA-enabled devices that need to be powered, such as, let's say, a built-in fan controller into your case. Or there's Molex as well. Molex is a completely different plug that did come included. We do have some Molex cables included with this power supply, but we don't have any Molex devices that are in this system, so we don't need to use those. The other thing is, with the matter of which way do you want to install the power supply, I generally say face down, especially with cases now having ventilation slots at the bottom with dust filters, as this one does. If your case does not have any sort of ventilation at the bottom here where the power supply mount is, then I would say flip it up top. Otherwise, I would go to the bottom. Now, this is a bit of a unique layout. Actually, there's plenty of cases that do this, but the S340 Elite actually has this bracket on the back with removable thumb screws, which you still, for some reason, need a screwdriver to remove. That's silly. And this is what you want to attach to the power supply first before you install it. I would say most cases do not use this method. Most cases you just slot the power supply in. Oh, that's the wrong way. You would just put the power supply in, and then you would just directly screw in 4 screws into the existing holes. but this is a little bit different. NZXT is getting all clever with it, so I'm going to get my power supply screws that came included with the case. I think you might also get some screws that come with your power supply, but more often than not, they're going to come with your case. So we're just going to mount this guy on here. Alrighty. Okay, now then, before we install the power supply, I'm going to connect all the cables that I need right now, because it's a lot easier that way to connect them outside of the case than it is to try to finagle them inside once the power supply is already installed. First SATA cable, and you want to make sure that you're plugging it in. It's all labeled, so it says PCIe, that's for our graphics cards, the CPU, obviously, and then peripheral IDE/SATA, which is what we want. That's the one we want right there. So you can just pop that sucker in and do the same thing for our other one. Boom. Okie dokie. So then now, what I like to do is sort of group the cables together and push them through the back side of the power supply mounting area and just slot it in like that and screw her down. Now some cases will have you mount the power supply from behind the motherboard tray this way. I'll just have you slot it in from this side as opposed to behind the case. But every case is a little bit different, so again, check your motherboard, or I'm sorry, your case manual for details. Alright, that looks good for now. We're going to leave the power supply cables as is for now. We're going to move on to something else. Let's do the front panel connectors. Oh, how exciting. So here's a look behind your motherboard tray, and for starters you can see our power supply that we literally just installed with all the cables coming from it. But then you've got this whole other mess of cables that seems to be stemming from the front of your case. Apart from these two, these are fan cables, we'll talk about that later. And these are your front panel connectors coming from the front. Everything that's at the front of your case, including the power button, reset button, power and hard drive LEDs, USB ports, audio jacks, etc., that all needs to get wired to your motherboard one way or another, and that's what these cables are for. So each one represents a different thing. You've got your USB 3.0, which is the big blue one, USB 2.0, which is labeled, and these really tiny ones, tiny ones and make up your hard drive and power LEDs, your reset button, power button, etc. And then you've got special things that pertain to only some cases, like your HDMI port here, if you're into VR, and an HD audio for your 3.5mm headphone and microphone jacks. So yeah, we've got these to plug in. We're gonna have to flip the case around so that we can start wiring these guys correctly to their appropriate headers. Alright, so we're on the other side of the case now. You can see I've already routed all of my front panel connectors through the various cutouts in the case. Now I did this strategically. I didn't just pick any old cutout and stick a cable through. I actually routed each cable through the cutout closest to its appropriate header, which is why the HD audio connector, or the HD audio plug, is right next to the HD audio connector on the motherboard. The USB 3.0 connector is right next to the USB 3 header on the motherboard, and so forth. So that makes it really easy for plugging and plugging things in. I'm just going to go ahead and start with the USB 3.0. Now the USB 3.0, in fact, all of these except for the really tiny cables, the really tiny connectors, are keyed. So you want to make sure that you're plugging them in the right way, or you're going to have a bad day and break some pins. I have broken many a USB 3.0 pin before, so I am a little nervous right now. There we go. USB 3 is secured. Moving on to the little guys. We'll move on to the little guys. The little guys, so we've got power LED, and hard drive LED. The common one that's missing here that the S340 Elite does not have is the reset